Right, this is Joyce Latimer from Virginia Tech, and I am going to talk about solving 4 mysteries of using PGRs on perennials. I'm going to talk about the other 3. So Mara talked about the work, the problems with echinacea and looking at day length and PGRs. I'm going to talk about volume with your liner soaks versus liner drenches, branching or growth control, tank mixes, and then how to avoid making PGR applications in the nursery. So let's get started. First of all, we're going to talk about the volume. That's the real issue when we compare liner soaks and liner drenches. Now, Brian did an excellent video. He did an excellent talk yesterday talking about the details of liner soaks. But if you missed that, he also did a video as part of our Before the Webinar series. And that is posted on YouTube at this URL, so you're welcome to check that out. I'm not going to cover the basics of making liner soaks. Simply, I want to show you the picture below shows you how we do a liner soak, essentially soaking the root system, the root ball, in the in the PGR solution. But we want to compare that to using liner drenches. There are growers asking, why can't I just do it over the top and do them all en masse before they're planted? And yes, there's an interest in doing that. So we're talking, of course, about soil active plant growth regulators, and we're talking essentially about a drench prior to transplanting. Now, you can do that manually, which is a little difficult to get uniform on liners. But the other thing you can do is use the irrigation boom or a water tunnel to actually apply those plant growth regulators. Remember, this is only for ones that are used. Your chemigation label is necessary for using a PGR in your boom or a water tunnel. But the question is, what kind of volume do you use? So let's talk about that. Initially, we had some studies where one of my students had some trouble with some treatments were applied as liner soaks when they were supposed to be done as drenches. And so we decided we need to compare those two to see if it really was a difference in the effect. And this was Penstemon Pike's Peak Purple, which I can tell you needs a lot of help. But we did find that there wasn't a lot of difference between the response to a liner soak and a liner drench, but there was some. So we continued to do some work in this area and did a study with, this is Angus Tacky, and we used the 1 ppm liner soak or a 1 ppm liner drench. The liner soak was allowed to soak for 2 minutes, and the liner drench was 10 milliliters, basically 1/3 of an ounce per cell, and that was a size 72 cell that the liners were actually produced in. So you can see that we got pretty much similar effects in the growth of Angus Tacky. Maybe a little more effect with the drench application, but we also did this with Salvia Garen, and you can see here again we had pretty much the same effects, except maybe a little more effect with the liner soak. So what's going on here? Excuse me. When these grow out, this is the Angus Tacky at 7 weeks after. Excuse me. You can see that we still have some nice growth control with these liner soaks or liner drenches. So basically you can use either one, whatever works for your system, whatever kind of operation, however it's best for you to mechanize it or simplify the process. In general, though, your drenches, including drenches on liners, are already labeled. They're already on the PGR labels. The liner soak is not on all of the PGR labels, so you're going to need to look at that. And then you need to test under your own conditions. The goal here is going to be to establish consistent applications. And that really gets down to the volume. Brian has talked about using liner soaks and the importance of a wet plug versus a dry plug that takes up a different volume. Well, if you are using a liner drench and you're trying to use a liner soak as your reference point, or a rate for a liner soak as a reference point, then you really need to be able to know what your volume is. You need to measure your volume because the volume, of course, is going to affect the amount of active ingredient that you apply to the plant and therefore the amount of growth response that you get. So the main thing is to develop a consistent application method, a consistent volume for your liner drenches, and then determine the rate that's effective for that crop under that system. And the liner drenches will work just as well for you as a liner soak. All right, mystery number 3. Do you want branching or do you want growth control? What if you need them both? Then we're talking about tank mixes. So we did a couple of different studies. I want to tell you about 2 of them. First of all, we used Angus Tacky and GRO, and we applied the plant growth regulators to stage 3 rooted liners. This is just after they come off the mist. And we had an untreated control. We had 500 parts per million Configure, 2,500 parts per million Dazide. Then we did a tank mix of those 2 products together. Then we also wondered, well, what if it's just the carrier? What if we just need more of a surfactant to get more of the Configure in? So we added a treatment that was the Configure plus the Dazide carrier. And of course, we needed to eliminate the Dazide carrier as well. So that was our study. With Angus Tacky, this is the liners. This is 3 weeks after treatment. This is right before we transplant. You can see that the Configure and the Dazide both gave us a reduction in growth. You can see the cell pack up on the picture above. The picture below actually shows a plant pulled out, so you can see the root system and see an individual plant. So you can see that the Configure did increase the number of branches, especially relative to the control, but also relative to the Dazide. So all of the treatments with Configure did increase the number of branches. You'll also notice that there's a delay in flowering. You can already see that some of our controls are, and the Dazide carrier are starting to set buds. So when we look at these, they actually needed a lot more height control than we gave them because they were overgrown at finish. So that tank mix, though, of Configure and Dazide did increase the number of leaders and the number of branches, both in the liner stage at 3 weeks after treatment and in the finished plants at 8 weeks after treatment. But neither the Configure plus Dazide carrier or the carrier alone increased branching at either time. So all the Configure treatments also reduced the height of the liners as well as the flower stalk height. But also it's very important to notice that the Configure treatments did delay flowering up to 6 days. On the GRO, for the liners, all of the Configure treatments, again, increased the number of leaders, and which is the number of major branches coming low in the plant, which is a good thing. And the Configure alone increased the branching on those leaders. So that was more branches than we actually had on the combination products, the tank mixes. The Dazide or the Dazide carrier both reduced the branching of the liners. The other thing you can see here is that the Configure delayed flowering. So looking at the finished plants here, you can see that all of the Configure treatments, again, increased branching. The Configure plus Dazide carrier increased the number of branches more than any of the others. And at 8 weeks, our plants have caught up. We're not, again, late in flowering. But overall, although the Configure increased branching and leaders, it did delay flower opening up to 12 days. So that's a little far. It's just something you need to keep in mind if you want to use it. This has not been consistent with GAR and some of our other treatments. Some of our other cultivars, we've not seen that much of a delay. So you're going to have to do some trials. Although the Dazide provided height regulation, it also reduced the number of branches in both Angus Tacky and GRO. We did an additional study. Well, let's talk about this first. Just to summarize Configure plus Dazide, it might be beneficial on some of your crops. You are going to need to run your own trials on multiple crops. And if you're applying it to liners, be sure and wait until those liners are fully rooted. Like I said, we usually make the first Configure application when the plants come off of mist. So they're pretty well rooted, and they usually will not show any additional effects on the root system. But also plan to make a second application, a follow-up application of Configure and or Dazide, depending on the crop's growth, at least 2 weeks after that first application. We also looked at a tank mix of Configure and paclobutrazol. We looked at 3 different crops, you can see here, and we used the Configure at a little bit higher rate. We used Piccolo at 120, and then we did a tank mix of Configure and Piccolo at those same rates. And this was a single application at label recommended volume. So echinacea, you can see here that the Piccolo treatments did reduce the height, whether it was alone or in combination with the Configure. The configure, whether it was alone or in combination, also increased the number of branches over the control. It gave about the same amount of effect, whether it was configure alone or configure plus piccolo. And when e-GRO, neither the configure nor the piccolo actually affected plant height or width, but we also saw an increase in the number of branches. There was an increase with configure and even more of an increase when we added the piccolo on there. So again, we had the effect of the configure regardless of whether it was combined with piccolo or by itself. Leucanthemum, we again didn't have a significant reduction in height, a little bit of variability there, but again a significant increase in the number of branches. So in summary, although both of the PGRs were effective, we did not get as much height control as we were looking for with piccolo. Combining them did not reduce the effectiveness of the individual chemicals. And on the other side, or the other hand, is that there was no evidence of any synergistic effect between these two products either. So based on this study and a couple others we've done, we're comfortable saying that you can mix your configure with your height control products and not reduce the effectiveness of either one. Again, you're going to need to look at doing a double application of your configure, and then you may need more than one application, of course, of your height control as well. So in summary, as I just said, your PGRs can be mixed with configure, and neither one affects the efficacy of the other. In some cases, you will see the configure has that dominant effect on the flowering. In other words, if a configure alone is going to reduce flowering, adding the growth retardant doesn't affect that. It doesn't relieve that problem. But we also saw that the configure can restore some of the branching, some of the repressed branching that you see with the growth retardants. So it might be a really good tank mix combination. All right, mystery number 4. How do you avoid nursery applications of PGRs? Well, it's really pretty simple. You simply apply the PGRs in the greenhouse or the transplant shed, right? But there are good reasons to do that. One is that you have more plant growth regulators available and labeled for use in the greenhouse or under cover than you do out in the nursery or in an outdoor pad. So that's the first thing. You've got more options to look at. There are also a broader range of labeled application methods. You can use media sprays. You can use the liner soaks. There are things you can do in the greenhouse that you can't do out in the field. The other thing is you have more control over your environmental conditions. So you should have better efficacy of your PGR applications if you do them in a more controlled environment. And then, of course, a lot of the ones that we're moving outdoors are very vigorous crops. And so this gives us easier control and early control of those vigorous crops. We are hearing that there is increasing EPA scrutiny of all outdoor applications of plant growth regulators. So that's another reason to focus on getting as many of those as we can into the greenhouse or the transplant shed. And of course, it's just a whole lot easier to do these things in the greenhouse on a bench than it is out in the nursery. So first of all, as far as how to reduce applications in the nursery, start with using your branching enhancers. They do a really good job of increasing your pot fill. The one we found the most effective on perennials has been configure. We've done some work with the Ethifon products, with Colate, and of course we did a good bit with e-GRO, but the configure seems to be the one that works the best with the herbaceous perennials. And we find a couple of things. One is that if we apply during the liner stage, which we've done a lot, Mara's done a lot of talks on using the branching enhancers during the liner production, you get an increase in the liners. In this case, with Autumn Joy, we got six times the number of branches on a liner treated with configure 600 parts per million at 3 weeks after treatment. Six times more than we had on the control. But if you grow that plant out without any additional treatments, the picture on the left there shows you that plant grown out, one application of configure during the liner stage. It doesn't have a significantly different number of branches than the untreated control. However, if you look at the picture on the right, if we make that application in the liner stage, then make a second application just after transplanting, we had 2.5 times the number of branches on that finished plant. So, and we've seen this with quite a few different crops. So I would highly recommend using your branching enhancers in the greenhouse before these plants go out to the nursery pad. Basically, the thing you need to remember about the branching enhancers is they have a very short-term activity. I say some crops, actually probably on most crops. So we do recommend the multiple applications. If you're growing your own liners, that's pretty easy because you're going to apply it during the rooting. Like I said, after you've got good rooting, but early in the stage. Then make that second application shortly after they are transplanted. Make sure you have 2 weeks between those applications. But what if you're buying liners in? Then you're going to want to apply your first application as soon as those liners are actively growing. You want to make sure you've got good foliage and good stems there, good growth there to take up that product. Then make your second application as close as you can to transplant time. Make sure again that you have 2 weeks in there to reduce any problems with phytotoxicity. So that's the start. Start with using branching enhancers. And the second thing is to go back to using liner soaks for other applications. Brian talked about liner soaks. We've talked about a number of different talks. You can use very low rates. You can treat a lot of plants at one time. This could also be done as a drench. I don't mean you have to do it as a soak, but making that application to the liner prior to transplant. And you can adjust that rate depending on how long you're going to need control. You don't know. I know you don't know. But again, we talk about using liners as a baseline control. If your crop is in particularly early and you know you're going to have to hold it, then you're going to go a little bit higher rate. The other thing to remember about all your applications at the liner stage or right after transplant is that these young plants are more affected by the plant growth regulator than if you wait later in production. The more mature plant does not respond as well to the plant growth regulator. So you have to adjust your rates based on the fact that it is early and how long you want it to last. Okay. But there are other PGR treatments that we can make around transplant time. So I want to tell you about a study we did using comparing the liner soak and the liner drench to a concise drench made the day after transplant, or it could even be the same day as transplant. And we used 10 fluid ounces per tray gallon pot, and then we also compared that to a concise spray that was made again the day after transplant, or it could be the day of transplant. Again, these are ones we do at the transplant shed before they go out into the field or the nursery pad. So this is Angus Tacky Blue Boa. Now actually you've seen these first two pictures, the liner soak and the liner drench, same study. What I want to add to that is the last two pots are the 1 part per million after transplant drench, that's our AT, and then the 30 part per million AT spray. And then the lower picture shows those plants in the same order at 4 weeks after treatment. And you can see that that 1 part per million AT drench did a real number on it, had a little bit more growth control than we needed, and even that spray rate was a little high. Again, because we were treating these plants when they were so young, they were very responsive to these PGRs. Now, of course, that 1 ppm after transplant drench is a lot more active ingredient than we applied to that liner soak or liner drench. Plus, it was throughout the entire pot. So the roots didn't grow out of the root ball into fresh soil. They grew continuously in access to that plant growth regulator. So again, you're going to have to play with rates here, but we also saw significant response. Salvia, we saw basically the same thing. The after transplant drench and the after transplant spray, both were very effective in growth control. A little bit too much on that drench rate. You might want to go back to 1/2 part per million or even 1/4 part per million. But at 7 weeks after treatment, finished plants looked great. Had nice growth control, no problem with flowering, a nice control here. So this is a way to treat those plants early before they go outdoors, before you have to mess with spraying them or making drenches in the outdoor environment. We also tried this on Eupatorium. We actually used much higher rates. You can see we're using 6 parts per million here. Although we got some response with the 6 part per million after transplant drench, we didn't have any persistent response. Even for finished plants, they were all overgrown. So you would still have to come back with additional control if you wanted to use even even these as a transplant type treatment. And that's likely. There are some of these crops that are going to be so vigorous that you're still going to have to treat them a second time out in the field. But if you can reduce any of those treatments in the field, then you're saving your back. So you do need to select the proper rates for these treatments, especially for that AT drench. There's a lot of information out there on spray rates that will help you with that. But again, just remember they're going to be a little more effective early than they would be if you were applying them 2 weeks after transplant and the plants were more established. The early applications of concised liners, of course, were very effective, gave us season-long control. That's going to depend on the rate that you use, and you are not necessarily looking for season-long control, but in this case we had it. So with proper rate selection, any of these application methods could be used in the greenhouse or the transplant shed before the plants are moved into the nursery. And our goal here again is to either reduce or eliminate the need for making these PGR applications outside and outdoor growing conditions. So we have a lot of other presentations and plant growth regulator publications that are posted on our website. We invite you to visit that. And of course, here's our contact information, my contact information, if you have any questions about any of the work later after you leave the webinar. And again, thanks to Fine Americas for sponsoring the webinar and for sponsoring our research. And I think that concludes my talk. I am going to open up, I'm going to ask Mara to open up her computer for questions.